Hi, I'm Gill Stannard. I'm a naturopath and I mentor health practitioners and health business owners. And I'm here again with my friend and mentor, Sue Evans, or Dr. Susanna Evans from University of Tasmania. And if you haven't seen the previous video, there'll be a link towards the end. If I put it up somewhere now, you'll get distracted. Okay, because I want you to stay on this and see what we're going to talk about. I want to pick up, Sue, from where we left off last time in our herbal ethics discussion. You finished with a really interesting phrase, which is, I use the herbs of my culture and not of my land. Do you want to explore that a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the story, Jill. And the story comes from, I was involved in a research project in southern Chile in the early 2000s. And this research project we were working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous health workers, trying to work out ways in which the two groups could work better together. And I was presenting some herbal lectures, in this Catholic University of Temuco in southern Chile. The first meeting that we had with the prospective students, and there were 50% Indigenous Chileans, Mapuche, and 50% non-Indigenous Chileans. One of the Indigenous women got up and said to me, what is your attitude to Indigenous rights? What is your attitude to intellectual property? And what is the cultural right by which you practice herbal medicine? Mm-hmm. Right? So, and I mean, I had been asked for a very long time, what were my qualifications in herbal medicine, but I'd never been asked about my cultural right? And as you know, I mean, some of the best learnings that you do as a teacher are the questions of your students, questions that you never would have thought of. And of course, got to think on your feet. So it's like, yes, well, I respect the Indigenous rights and intellectual property of Indigenous people, and that's when it came out of my mouth. I use the plants of my culture and not of my land, because I'm an Australian herbalist of European extraction. So I don't use Indigenous plants here, and we can go into the reasons for that, and that's a whole other topic. But I mean, people and plants have moved around the planet forever. And as people have moved, they've brought their plants, and humans have assisted plants in moving. Now, when the first fleet arrived, 26th of January 1788, on the first fleet, there were a lot of plants, because Joseph Banks had sat there in Kew Gardens and had made lists of the plants that the Europeans were going to need in Australia in order to survive. And amongst that were herbs. And we know that on the 26th of January 1788, first fleet arrived. By the 1st of March 1788, there was a herb garden had been planted in the rocks in Sydney to provide the needs for Sydney General Hospital. And the plants that came were, there was chamomile and hyssop and lavender and rosemary, all sorts of plants. Now, I wouldn't say that, I don't know that whether or not there was much transfer of medicinal plant knowledge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in those early days. Certainly many of the early medical practitioners were very keen botanists and very interested in local plants. What we do know is that today, naturopaths and herbalists don't use many Indigenous plants. I mean, we might use a bit of eucalyptus oil or tea tree oil, but we don't use those. Now, when this woman was asking me about my cultural right, my response was, my cultural right is that I can tell you stories of St. John's wort and lavender that I can't tell you of kangaroo paw and waratah. And so, I mean, I do think that herbal medicine is more than the constituents of the plant. And it's more than the phytochemistry. and it's more than the evidence base. There's also a cultural aspect to herbal medicine, and it's how those plants and our understanding of those plants have been imbued in the arts, in literature and music. You might remember, Gill, but many, many years ago, do you remember?
Poke salad Annie, you're going to talk.
Yes. I wrote an article talking about the references to medicinal plants in popular music.
Yes.
And I subsequently wrote an article about it. And I would say that it's not that, I mean, and there are loads of references to medicinal plants in popular music. And I wouldn't say that the people who wrote that popular music were herbalists or were trying to communicate particular medicinal actions. But what I would say is that there's a consistency. An artist has a consistency between the energy of the plant and the energy of the music, that in this case, the music. So, for example, when Elton John is singing about elderberry wine, it's very schmaltzy. When I was when you were my wife, Elton John, when you were my wife, we drank elderberry wine, whatever. It's a very, like, the music is very, I don't know what you'd call it, but it's, it's certainly, I'd call it schmaltzy. And elderflower and elderberry is a very gentle medicine, whereas when Tony Joe White sings about Poke Salad Annie, and he's singing about, he's talking about the leaves of Phytolacca. And although he's not saying that, he's not talking about the medicinal actions, but he's saying that the people who used the leaves of Phytolacca as salad, Poke Salad Annie, that they were, that the grandma was so mean, that she was so mean that they made the crocodiles look tame. So there's an, if they're, Hot Chili Woman, I mean, the music is raucous. Yes. And it needs to be played at a high, it would be really inappropriate to be singing about,
chamomile.
Chamomile as hot chili, or hot chili as mixing that with elderflower. Yeah. And so that's what I mean. There's a consistency between the two. And one of the things that I love about the stories of medicinal plants is that, I mean, look, sometimes I think that if you really know the stories, it's sort of like jazz, it's sort of like improvisation, like if you understand something about the plant and its story, then I don't know, there's a deeper understanding of the energy and how you can use that plant. Anyway,
I love that sidetrack, because as you know, I have a bit of a passion since I was a student about the energetics of plants, or rather matching the energy of the plant, the characteristics of the plant to the person. And then there's also that kind of, I think that cultural overlay can come in there as well, that when you talk to not so much an English client, but a Mediterranean client about herbal teas, do you have any herbal teas at home? They will say, well, yes, I have chamomile, but only when I'm sick. Yeah. That's what my mother or my nonna gave to me when I was sick. And they're not herbalists, but they have herbal traditions within their families. So for you as a descendant of a first fleeter, for me as a migrant from New Zealand, but we share that very Anglo history. Thinking about European herbs, our Western herbal materia medica has changed a lot in the 30 years that I have been in practice. I don't think we even may not even have had withania when I was doing herbal medicine. That came in kind of in the early 90s, and learning the energetics, the cultural appropriateness, the symptom pictures of these herbs kind of one by one. Now it seems to me that herbalists in particularly Australia and perhaps New Zealand, you know, there's a very diverse cultural history of the herbs. There might be an Ayurvedic herb, a Chinese herb, something from Siberia, very, very diverse. I've heard whispers of discussions that have been going on about the appropriateness of this integration of the Western herbal materia medica. So what is this chatter about the decolonisation?
Well, yes. I mean, I guess the question is, how do we know a herb? You know, and do we, and what is the, how do we understand it? I think that what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years is that as we've moved more to an evidence base for herbal medicine, and there's been more of an emphasis on phytochemistry, how we understand the plant's action has moved from tradition and story to a different sort of evidence. Now, that might be more, some would argue that that's a more universal understanding, that scientific understanding is a more universal understanding. But I guess there's a question about, okay, so what about different ways of knowing? I mean, is that the only way that we're going to know the plant? And is that appropriate that that's the only way that we only know the plant? Now, I'm just having a moment, Jill, you'll be able to help me. That the 2 volumes, the big blue book, The Energetics of Herbs. Do you remember that?
Do you remember the Michael Chiera one?
No, it wasn't Michael Chiera. No. Anyway, it might come to me. But it was an attempt to put together Chinese
yes,
Chinese, Ayurvedic, and Western.
Yeah.
And my question is, well, if you do that, is that like a McDonaldization of herbal medicine? Does it actually, and this is such a question, I mean, it's a question in so many areas of a multicultural society, you know, how much do we keep to our own traditions in order to keep those kind of bounded, or to keep a deep understanding of that? And how and in what ways do we share? I mean, absolutely, you know, I'm certainly not saying that the materia medica needs to be fixed. You know, a tradition that is alive is going to change. A tradition that doesn't change is ossified.
Yeah.
And we need to change our understandings as society changes, and as we have, you know, we now need to understand, okay, so what are herbal interventions for COVID going to be, you know, or for long COVID? So this is something that, you know, 5 years ago we didn't have to. So we do need to change, and we will be including different plants. But there is a question about, I think, with the whole question of colonisation and decolonisation, it's like, well, whose voices are being heard, and whose stories about the plants are being heard? And that is, I mean, it's something that we need to think about in terms of herbal medicine, just as we need to think about in terms of all sorts of other areas. And that's something, as we've talked about, the National Institute of Medical Herbalists have the next conference early next month in October.
It's early October 2021.
Yeah, right. And I'm facilitating a panel looking at some of these issues with a range of different people on the whole issue of, you know, what has been the influence of colonisation on the materia medica, and how do we broaden the number of voices and the stories that are being heard. I mean, one of the ones I think I mentioned at a recent conference in last May 2021 on the Gold Coast was that, for example, with black haw, you know, Viburnum prunifolium, it was quite shocking to me to hear the story that this is a plant. I mean, I've certainly used it in the past, assisting with people who are preventing miscarriage. But there's also evidence that some herbalists have found about it being used. That now, one of the issues in the times of slavery in North America was that women sometimes tried to abort their children because they didn't want their children to be born into slavery. Mm. However, the slave owner would see that as depriving him of property because slaves were property.
Yeah.
And black haw was used to stop those terminations.
Wow.
And that was like, whoa, that is a story of black haw that I had never, and for those people who are listening to this who don't know, the plant Viburnum prunifolium is black haw, HAW, right?
Yeah, good distinction.
Yes, yeah. But it is a story. I think that it's what I mean about, okay, let's include more stories.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the post-colonisation American herbal materia medica is a really interesting case of a lot of cultural appropriation from the Indigenous people. That, they would have been like the first fleeters coming across with their their British and European herbs, and things that we think of now as part of our materia medica, the hydrastis, the golden seal and echinacea. Yes. We just take that for granted. That's lumped into our Western because it's not, from another not tradition, but it actually is from another tradition.
Yeah.
So it makes me think then as a herbal consumer. So two herbs I take very regularly post-cancer have been turmeric and echinacea.
Yeah.
Am I then part of the dark side of the colonial heritage by using plants on a daily basis from other cultures?
Like such big questions. I mean, I guess and I don't think that we certainly don't have answers to this. I think we have first steps in terms of recognizing, firstly, recognizing that cultural appropriation has happened.
Yes.
Having discussions about, okay, so what is the appropriate way to recognize this and move forward? In some cases, for example, that might be changing the common name of the herb. Michella repens, which is a North American plant, in the past was called squaw vine. That's seen as an inappropriate name by First Nations people, and it's now commonly referred to as partridge berry. So sometimes it will be changing the name, and sometimes it will be including other stories. There will no doubt suggestions as to other appropriate ways to acknowledge this history will be developed, but I mean, I certainly don't know what they are at this point in time. And yeah, I mean, one of the things, I think that we've talked about in the past in terms of sourcing would be, all right, so say with turmeric, turmeric is a valuable cash crop for certainly for some farmers in India and other places. And so I don't think it's a matter of saying, okay, we can't use this herb, but it may be a thing of just being more aware of where that plant might come from, and the origins of the plant, and Yeah. So it's a developing story, Jill.
It is, and it's like it's interesting for me that I always think of turmeric as the times that I spent in Bali, where it is the local remedy for everything.
Okay.
If you've got a headache, cut a slice of turmeric and put it on your forehead. Come off your motorbike, you've got a bad scrape, put some turmeric on it. You know, got a cough or a cold, take some turmeric. It is the panacea. And in a weird way, taking even that as a tablet, it makes me, particularly we're doing this in the middle of the global pandemic and we're not traveling, it weirdly brings me closer to those stories that have been shared happily with me by locals in that culture.
Yeah.
So as we wrap this up, because I think there's been some really meaty concepts here today, you got any kind of takeaways for both herbalists / naturopaths who use herbs and consumers to consider?
Well, I suppose, I mean, one of the things that I always come back to is the generosity of plants. When we get back to the actual plant itself and we get to know the plant itself. I mean, I was, as you know, I live in an apartment block. I was up in my rooftop garden yesterday, and it just struck me yet again as I saw as I was rearranging, my small garden, just the way that the plants reproduce and the way that the plants keep giving. And somehow I think the more that we can get back to the plant and get to know the plant and realize how generous the earth is and how generous plants are, then I think it encourages us to share all these stories. And just that plants don't belong to one culture and they don't belong to one way of using them. There's a multiplicity of ways that we can use them and a multiplicity of stories around them. So just encouraging people to love the plants, that's all.
And I think it's also that's wonderful. There's also been discussion elsewhere about, because many of us are brown bottle or even brown tablet herbalists, for both ourselves as those who are dispensing and our clients who are taking the remedies. It's some herbalists actually will show pictures of the herbs, and if they have more time to tell some stories of the herbs, actually, if we're not making our medicines ourselves, at least I think that's a really good thing to put out there for herbalists who are urban herbalists who aren't making their own medicines, as a step to reconnect with the plant. And then even just one plant that you have an affinity for, that you find you're prescribing a lot, to not only eyeball it, if you can contact it, to smell it, all those sorts of things, but to dig down and find the stories. I think that's a great takeaway from this conversation today.
Great.
So as always, it's been an absolute tonic, and I mean that deliberately. It's been a tonic talking to reconnect with the plants and think about our roots, and also think about our ethics and responsibility. If you have enjoyed watching this podcast, would you please hit the like button, and if you think you'd like to see some more talks like this in the future, subscribe. Thank you very much. Jill, one more thing, Sue.
Can you put the link to the NIMH conference?
Absolutely, I will do that as well, and I will see whether I can find that NHAA paper, if sometimes they are floating around the internet. And also too, what I didn't say at the time was I remember you delivering that, I think it was on a Friday or Saturday night of the very first NHAA international conference on the Colorado Plateau. So it was very, very memorable experience. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll be back with more when the feeling takes us, when the mood takes us. Thank you.